Okay, let's try and unpack this. The sheer scale of homelessness in the U.S. I mean, the January 2024 numbers, they really hit me. We're talking roughly 771,480 individuals.
Wow.
Yeah, that's like 23 out of every 10,000 Americans without a place they can really call home.
And that increase you mentioned, the 18% jump from just the year before.
Exactly. That jump, it just really underscores how urgent this whole situation is becoming.
Yeah, the magnitude of that increase is, well, it's quite telling, isn't it? It suggests some pretty significant pressures are pushing more people towards homelessness, not fewer.
Absolutely. And it gets particularly concerning when you look at who's being affected most.
Mm.
The number of homeless children under 18 saw this staggering 33% rise. That brings the total to around 150,000 kids.
15,000, that's hard to even fathom.
It is. And then you see the stark racial disparities. Black Americans, they make up about, what, 12% of the U.S. population?
Higher than that, yeah.
But they account for a massively disproportionate 32% of those experiencing homelessness.
That disparity is consistently highlighted in the data. It points towards deeper systemic issues.
Right. So for this deep dive, we've looked at a whole range of reports, data, different sources, really trying to get our heads around the multifaceted nature of this crisis.
Yeah.
Our mission here isn't just to rattle off these sobering statistics. We want to actually delve into the underlying factors, the complexities that contribute to this problem.
And it's so crucial to move beyond those surface-level explanations, isn't it? The reality of homelessness, it's woven from this really complex tapestry of individual vulnerabilities and systemic failings.
Okay, so let's start trying to untangle that tapestry then. We often think, maybe simplistically, of job loss as a primary cause. And sure, that's definitely a factor.
Of course.
But our sources point to less obvious, maybe, but equally critical issues.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me was just how precarious things are for so many people.
How close to the edge they are.
Exactly. Like just one missed paycheck, one unexpected medical bill away from eviction, and then potentially homelessness.
Yeah.
The crushing burden of rent for so many people is a huge pressure point.
Yeah, and building on that, what the sources really hammer home is how the scarcity of genuinely affordable housing creates this incredibly fragile situation for, well, a really large segment of society.
Right.
Any kind of financial shock, even a relatively small one, can just tip them over the edge into housing insecurity.
And it's not just about what's happening right now economically. We also have to consider the long-term consequences of past policies.
Definitely.
Take deinstitutionalization, for example. The move to close those big state-run psychiatric hospitals back in the mid to late 20th century.
Yeah.
The idea, in theory, was for more humane, community-based care.
But that raises such a critical point, doesn't it, about how even well-intentioned policies can fall really short in the execution.
Yeah.
The idea was, okay, let's shift towards robust community mental health services. But the reality, those support systems were often seriously underfunded, inadequate, really, to meet the complex needs of the individuals who were discharged.
Exactly. I remember one report we looked at, it detailed how the closure of, I think it was State Hospital X in one specific county, led directly to a significant jump in unsheltered folks in that area within just months.
Wow. Shows that immediate impact.
Yeah, it illustrates the immediate fallout when that community support isn't there.
Yeah.
So you had people with significant mental health needs suddenly without the structured care they relied on. And that, unfortunately, often pushed them towards homelessness.
A direct link.
Then there's this whole dynamic of NIMBYism, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
Even in communities that might, express empathy for homeless people in principle.
Right, in the abstract.
There's often really strong opposition when it comes to actually developing affordable housing or shelters in their own neighborhoods.
And that's a key tension the sources highlighted, this sort of stated desire to address homelessness as a general societal problem, but then this resistance to accepting practical solutions locally.
Yeah.
And that local opposition, it really does significantly impede the creation of the very resources that are needed.
And we absolutely cannot overlook the deeply embedded historical factors.
Yeah.
Things like redlining and other discriminatory racial housing policies from decades ago.
The legacy of that.
They've created these enduring patterns of housing instability in communities of color This systemic disinvestment, it's had such a long-lasting impact on things like wealth accumulation, access to stable housing.
It's not just history, is it? It's actively shaping vulnerability today.
Exactly. It's not just some past injustice.
Hmm.
These policies are directly shaping who is most vulnerable to homelessness right now.
Hmm.
There's a direct line from those discriminatory practices to current realities. It's just crucial to recognize that homelessness isn't some random occurrence. It's often a direct outcome of policy choices
Hmm.
or, lack of policy.
That's such a vital reframing. It really shifts the focus away from just blaming individuals towards looking at the broader societal and systemic forces at play.
Now, this next distinction was quite interesting to me. The legal system sometimes differentiates between what it calls intentional and unintentional homelessness.
Okay.
So unintentional homelessness, as you'd guess, often comes from unforeseen things, job loss, medical emergencies, natural disasters, the kind of events that could really happen to anyone.
And those are precisely the kinds of things that just underscore that inherent vulnerability that so many individuals and families face day to day.
Right, but intentional homelessness, that's a specific legal classification. It's where an individual is considered to have, deliberately caused their own homelessness, maybe by voluntarily leaving suitable accommodation without what's deemed a justifiable reason.
Okay.
And this label, this designation, according to info from Shelter England, we looked at it, can actually impact whether someone is eligible for housing assistance.
Right. And what the sources really push us to consider there is the often very blurry line, isn't it, between a genuine uncoerced choice and a decision that's made under extreme duress, or simply because there were no other viable alternatives left.
Exactly.
That legal distinction, it feels like it could mask some really complex realities.
Absolutely. And then we need to remember that homelessness isn't just one single experience. It's not monolithic. There are different categories, right?
Yes, definitely.
There's chronic homelessness that usually refers to individuals who've been homeless long-term, often dealing with disabilities or chronic illnesses. Then you have transitional homelessness, which is generally more temporary, maybe resulting from a financial setback or an eviction.
A crisis point.
Yeah. And episodic homelessness, that describes people who go through repeated cycles of being homeless.
And what's equally important to grasp, I think, is the whole concept of hidden homelessness.
Right. Tell us about that.
Well, this includes people who are temporarily staying with others, couch surfing, or maybe living in their cars, or doubling up with family or friends in situations that are often really overcrowded and precarious.
This is that part of the homeless population that just often goes uncounted, unseen.
Exactly.
And it seems to disproportionately affect women, LGBTQ plus youth, immigrants, people who might be less likely, for various reasons, to engage with formal support systems.
Yeah.
So for every person we might visibly see on the street, there could be many, many more just barely managing, unseen, and facing pretty significant risks.
It really underscores the limitations of just relying on counts from shelters or street counts, doesn't it? It gives you a really incomplete picture of the actual extent of housing insecurity out there.
Which leads us into a rather nuanced area, these intentional communities and alternative living situations.
Ooh, like van leafers.
Yeah, exactly. Van leafers, people embracing off-grid living, minimalist travelers. It can sometimes be genuinely challenging to differentiate between someone making a deliberate choice for a non-traditional lifestyle and a situation that's actually driven by underlying housing insecurity.
It was quite striking, actually, seeing how the perception of these lifestyles can vary so dramatically.
How so?
Well, for individuals who have financial stability, resources, a safety net, it's often romanticized, isn't it? Seen as this path to freedom and adventure.
Right. Hashtag van life.
Exactly. But for others, it can just represent a really precarious existence that's born out of necessity, out of very limited options.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? It often boils down to access to resources, having a safety net. Do you have backup plans? Was this a genuine choice, or is it more like a last resort? And how is it viewed culturally?
Yeah.
Is it celebrated as this adventurous lifestyle, or is it stigmatized as a sign of hardship or failure?
Yeah.
It really prompts that question. When does alternative housing actually embody freedom, and when does it just reflect a failure of societal support?
It definitely compels us to question our kind of fundamental assumptions about what constitutes a home and the really diverse reasons why people might live outside of conventional housing.
And homelessness, it's not some isolated problem floating out there. It's deeply interwoven with these broader systemic structures. Housing, obviously, but also healthcare, employment opportunities, the justice system. Disruptions or failures in any one of those areas can significantly ramp up an individual's risk of losing their housing.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, inadequacies or breakdowns within any of these interconnected systems can create this sort of cascade of negative consequences,
Right.
ultimately contributing to or prolonging someone's experience of homelessness.
Some cities are trying to use data-driven strategies to tackle this.
Mm.
Toronto, for instance, they use these complex data systems to try and improve the coordination of services. But, as our sources point out, actually ensuring these systems are truly comprehensive and genuinely responsive to individual needs, well, that remains an ongoing challenge.
But what does offer some encouragement are the examples where things are working, where models are proving effective.
Like Houston.
Exactly. Houston's The Way Home initiative really stands out. It's a compelling example of what can be achieved when nonprofits and government agencies actually collaborate effectively.
Mm-hmm.
They've managed to achieve a really notable reduction in homelessness through a coordinated, data-informed strategy. Collaboration seems key there.
Okay, so solutions exist, but let's talk about the barriers. Even when people experiencing homelessness are actively trying to get back into housing, they run into these huge obstacles.
Yeah.
One particularly damaging one is the criminalization of homelessness itself.
Oh, definitely.
Laws targeting things like sleeping in your car or loitering or even just asking for money.
Oh.
They might look like they're addressing public order concerns.
Right, on the surface.
But in reality, they often just further entrench people in homelessness.
And this raises a fundamental question about the actual intent behind those laws, doesn't it? Instead of offering solutions, they frequently just result in arrest records.
Which then becomes another huge barrier.
Exactly. Another significant impediment to securing both housing and employment. It creates this vicious cycle that's just incredibly difficult to break free from.
And then you have the limitations within the shelter system itself. Shelters, they provide a crucial emergency service, no doubt.
Of course. A lifeline for many.
But they can be overcrowded. They might not feel safe to everyone, and they often operate under these really strict rules that just don't accommodate everyone's needs.
Like what specifically?
Well, things like gender segregation. They can be problematic for trans or non-binary individuals, restrictions on bringing pets, or requirements for sobriety that some people aren't ready for or can't meet.
And one particularly insightful point from the sources was how, for some individuals, especially those who've experienced trauma or maybe belong to marginalized communities like LGBTQ plus youth, the streets might actually be perceived as a less dangerous option than certain shelter environments.
That's a deeply concerning thought, isn't it?
Mm.
If the whole concept of home is fundamentally linked to safety and security,
Right.
the fact that some people feel safer on the streets just speaks volumes about the shortcomings in our current support systems.
It really does.
And this is particularly evident when we look specifically at youth homelessness.
Yes.
The main drivers for young people ending up homeless often include things like family rejection, especially, as you mentioned, for LGBTQ plus youth.
A huge factor.
Aging out of the foster care system without adequate support networks in place, and escaping situations of domestic violence or abuse at home.
And these young people, they face alarmingly high levels of risk. Increased vulnerability to exploitation, major disruptions to their education and development, and this long-term instability that can just have profound, lasting consequences throughout their lives.
The source material really emphasized the deeply traumatic impact of being rejected by your own family for these young people.
Yeah.
I mean, if the place where you're meant to feel most loved and secure turns you away, that creates this profound wound.
Mm-hmm.
It must take an immense amount of time and support to even begin to heal.
It really just underscores that fundamental human need for acceptance and belonging, doesn't it? Especially during those critical formative years, adolescence, early adulthood.
Okay, so beyond the practicalities, just having shelter, there are these significant philosophical and psychological dimensions to homelessness, too.
Absolutely.
Home isn't just about having a physical structure, is it? It provides that foundation for stability, a crucial sense of identity, and that fundamental feeling of belonging within a community.
Mm.
And the loss of those elements, it has a profound psychological impact.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture, the sheer existence of widespread homelessness kind of forces us to confront our core societal values.
Yeah, what do we stand for?
Right. What are our collective priorities? Do we truly believe that housing is a fundamental human right? It compels us to grapple with some pretty uncomfortable questions about equity, justice, and, frankly, compassion.
And just the day-to-day reality of being homeless involves this profound loss of routine and personal agency.
Control over your own life.
Exactly. Just imagine not being able to control even the simplest aspects of your day, like when you wake up or where you can go to the bathroom or wash. That constant lack of autonomy has got to be a significant source of ongoing trauma.
And one particularly insightful point was how this constant state of survival mode can profoundly affect mental health.
It's a two-way street, right?
Absolutely. Homelessness can both be a consequence of mental health challenges and also a major contributing factor to them. It can seriously impair executive functions, making long-term planning incredibly difficult, and it can significantly disrupt emotional regulation.
The source material put it quite powerfully. Not having a home isn't just a stressful situation. It fundamentally disorients your sense of self.
Yeah.
It gradually erodes your sense of who you even are.
It completely undermines that essential foundation of self that's so often tied to having a sense of place, security, personal space.
Okay, but on a more optimistic note, there are innovative solutions being tried out there.
Good. Let's hear some.
Well, Australia has this youth-focused initiative called Kids Undercover.
Okay.
What they do is provide these small, independent studio units, basically often in the backyards of existing homes, to alleviate overcrowding and give young people some privacy and stability.
Interesting approach.
And apparently, in the state of Victoria, this program has been correlated with a 12% reduction in youth homelessness.
Wow, 12%. That's significant. It really underscores the value of targeted interventions, doesn't it? Solutions specifically designed to address the unique needs of different groups within the homeless population.
Definitely. And then there's the housing first approach. This is gaining increasing recognition, being implemented more widely.
Yes, I've heard a lot about that.
The core idea, the central tenet of this philosophy, is to provide immediate and permanent housing to people experiencing homelessness without any preconditions.
So no hoops to jump through first.
Exactly. No requirements for sobriety, no mandatory participation in treatment programs before you get housing. The underlying principle is simply that stable housing is the essential foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that's in place, other challenges like employment or health issues can be more effectively addressed.
Which makes intuitive sense, right? This model acknowledges the fundamental reality that it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to effectively work on things like finding a job or dealing with substance use recovery when you're in this constant state of uncertainty about where you're going to sleep tonight.
Yeah, basic needs first. It's also really illuminating to look at international perspectives on this. Finland stands out.
Ah, yes, Finland.
They're basically the only country in the European Union where homelessness rates are actually declining.
That's amazing. How?
And their success is largely attributed to a really widespread adoption of the housing first model. Support services are integrated after people are housed, not as a condition beforehand.
That strongly suggests that this fundamental shift in approach, prioritizing housing as the primary essential need, can actually yield significant positive results. It's proof of concept, really.
Then you have Japan, which offers kind of a contrasting picture.
Oh.
Visible homelessness there is relatively uncommon. But there's this strong cultural emphasis on privacy and independence. And combined with high housing costs, it's led to this phenomenon of internet cafe refugees.
Right, I've read about that. People living in 24-hour cafes.
Yeah, individuals who basically reside in these 24-hour internet cafes because they just can't afford conventional housing.
So it highlights how homelessness can manifest in really diverse ways, depending on the specific cultural and economic context of a society. It's not always visible street homelessness.
Exactly. And then in the global south, you have the reality of informal housing slums, favelas, which is a significant experience for millions.
Mm-hmm.
And while these places often lack basic infrastructure, sanitation, security of tenure,
Mm-hmm.
they can, maybe surprisingly, foster really strong senses of community and social support networks.
That's an interesting paradox.
It is, and it really makes you consider, what if every individual actually had a legally recognized right to housing? How would societies be compelled to adapt their structures, their priorities, if that fundamental human need was enshrined in law?
It's a profound thought experiment, isn't it? It really challenges our prevailing assumptions about housing just being a market commodity rather than potentially a fundamental and alienable human right.
We often define home by, what it contains, the warmth, the connections, that sense of personal space,
Yeah.
privacy.
Yeah, the feeling of it.
But as our deep dive into all this is kind of illuminated, the experience of homelessness reveals an even more fundamental truth, I think. A home isn't just a luxury or some kind of reward to be earned.
Yeah.
It feels more like a fundamental human need, a foundational element for just developing as a person for personhood itself.
A prerequisite, almost.
Yeah. And when that foundation is absent, what's lost extends so far beyond just mere shelter. It encompasses belonging, safety, and, yeah, sometimes your very sense of self.
So, ultimately, if we're serious about trying to solve this incredibly complex challenge of homelessness,
Hmm?
we have to first confront ourselves with a really fundamental question about the very nature of the society we are collectively building.
Which is,
What kind of society are we building if the provision of something as basic as shelter
yeah.
is conditional?